Welcome. It's a little warm in here. We're going to see if we can get this addressed. We usually don't turn on the air conditioning in the college until a little later, but I've got some phone calls, so we'll see what we can do. It's a pleasure to introduce today's performance of symphonic jazz. The Great Woods Symphony Orchestra, I think, is a wonderful example of the vibrant partnership between Wheaton College and our surrounding community. This ensemble includes not only our talented students and faculty, but also local residents, musicians of all ages and backgrounds, including several area high school students. Their presence enriches the musical experience for everyone involved. They help the orchestra play a broader and more ambitious repertoire while providing a more robust learning experience for our students. In turn, the orchestra offers everyone a meaningful and free way to continue making music. It's a beautiful, mutual, town-gown collaboration, and we're very proud of it. Today's concert is particularly special. Our musical director, Professor Del Pace, and the Great Woods Symphony Orchestra are honored to perform William Grant Still's Afro-American Symphony, a landmark work that stands as both the most important African-American contribution to the symphonic tradition and one of the great achievements of American orchestral music. This concert also speaks to Wheaton's broader mission to expand the ways we understand culture and to honor the profound contributions of communities whose voices have often been overlooked. Through music, we celebrate those voices today. Enjoy the performance, and thank you for coming.
soloists, Addie and George. Have another round of applause for them. It's tough to do your final exam in general, but to have to do it in front of a couple hundred people in public, it's extra pressure, and they both did a fantastic job. So the title of this concert is Symphonic Jazz. Now, I know that the first two pieces were not jazzy. I do know that, okay? And I'm assuming you know that as well. So we are going to move on to the sort of thematic portion of the concert. And I want to say a few things, a few words about this concert and kind of the approach before we get started. So the idea of this concert, I'm looking at my notes here because there's kind of a lot. I'm a professor and I always lecture. So all the pieces you're going to hear today were composed actually within the first third of the 20th century, so in a very compressed time frame. And that's because that's a time period where American classical music and American popular music basically blew up, as the kids say. It became internationally known and started to transform music across the world. On the classical side, you've got composers like Aaron Copland, Charles Ives, George Gershwin, William Grant Still, who we're going to hear. And they were creating a uniquely American form of classical music. Oftentimes they did that by drawing on uniquely American forms of popular or vernacular or folk music. And oftentimes, for all those composers, it was the music of Black Americans. Now, in the early part of the 20th century, thanks to the ending of Reconstruction in the last quarter of the 19th century, there was a phenomenon in American history called the Great Migration, in which we saw hundreds of thousands of African Americans flee the South, essentially as refugees from racially based violence. And they came to northern cities and brought with them the music of their communities, their churches, the folk music, the dances, etc. And in so doing, they transformed American music and world music. The root genre of all the music that became sort of really important in the early 20th century is the music of the Black church. And the most important of these genres is the genre called the spirituals. You might have heard of them before, and we're going to hear one in just a minute. These were anonymously composed hymns, essentially, that were sung as part of church services. There were two broad categories. There were the sorrow songs, which, as you can imagine, were very tragic. They were slow and mournful. And then there were the shouts, which were songs of praise. Now, the sorrow songs gave birth to essentially the blues and sort of jazz ballads. And the shouts gave birth to all the syncopated dance music that we might know, essentially ragtime, ragtime for early jazz, then eventually rock and roll, soul, funk, hip-hop, all the syncopated music that we listen to today. So to understand how African-American music impacted classical music in America, we have to start with spirituals. And luckily, George is going to share with us one of the most famous spirituals. It's called Deep River. It's a song of sorrow, but also of hope for deliverance in the here and in the now, as well as, that makes sense, let's try it again, in the here and now and in the life to come. Many spirituals are talking about the hope for deliverance and salvation, both from slavery as well as from sin. So they kind of did sort of two things at the same time. Deep River is this beautiful song. Even though it's sorrowful, it's not fully tragic. It's actually in a major key. And it's performed for us in a classical version that was created by the Black composer Harry T. Burleigh. I took his arrangement and just for the piano and voice, and I arranged it for strings, just so we could present it to you with orchestra. So George is going to share this wonderful spiritual Deep River for us now.
See
supposed to leave. I forgot about that. I was supposed to stay right here. It's the choreography that always gets you. We just listened to a big piece of sacred music from the Black Church, but the secular music of Southern Black communities is essentially just as important, a root of the music that we know today on the radio, as well as jazz and blues, but also the music we're going to hear a little later this concert, the symphonic music. And a really important feature of all African American music, but especially secular music, folk music, is syncopation. Now, syncopation is a rhythmic structure in music that essentially challenges the predictability of the beat. So, for example, in Western classical traditions, it is meant to be played by people who are sitting down, for people who are sitting down. Remember, Beethoven is not dance music. Composers have always written rhythms like this. So imagine you've got a composer who had a lyric that was like, I got rhythm, I got music, I got my man. Okay, imagine that. And you wanted to set it as a classical composer. You would set it like this. I got rhythm, I got music, I got my man. Or maybe, I got rhythm, I got music, I got my man. Nothing wrong with that. It doesn't really make you want to dance, but that's okay. That's not the point. But there's all African American music has some kind of embodied component, right? It's sort of, you're not moving in some way, you're kind of doing it wrong. So the rhythms that were used by African American slaves and members of the African American community in the United States afterwards are syncopated. So, and because syncopated rhythms make you want to move, they do that by pulling your brain and body literally in two different directions at the same time, which makes you want to dance. So a syncopated rhythm, which George Gershwin ended up using, would be like this. I got rhythm, I got music, I got my man. So you notice how it's all the words are actually off of the clapping. So part of your brain wants to do this with the clap, part of your brain wants to do this when it hears the rhythm, and that's why your body dances. That's actually why it happens, believe it or not. So we're going to hear some examples of, some wonderful examples of secular folk music, syncopated folk music in the next piece. It's a suite by Florence Price, who is one of the most important African American composers, the most important female African American composer. And she actually has a Boston connection, studied at NEC up in Boston. She did this version of 3 secular folk tunes, originally for piano. We're going to do a version I just found out that's transcribed for strings to allow us to play it. And I think it works really well because the original version of these songs would have been performed essentially by a couple of fiddles, a banjo, maybe a washtub bass. So string instruments that you would find around a campfire, in the American South somewhere, some rural area. And so we can kind of imagine the original version of these syncopated dance tunes in this orchestral arrangement for strings. So it's Florence Price's 3 little dances. So as a few more people join the stage, I'll say a few more words about what's going to happen next. So now, if that was sort of music maybe the 19th century, sort of folk, syncopated, secular folk tunes, you'd sort of dance around the campfire. The next thing we're going to hear is urban music. And we're going to hear kind of music called ragtime. Now ragtime is a syncopated dance music that developed out of secular folk music as well as sacred shouts from the Black church. And probably the most famous composer, well certainly the most famous composer of ragtime is the Black composer Scott Joplin. You can definitely hear his music, The Entertainer. You've all heard it, right? So ragtime was the syncopated piano music. Eventually, he thought more composers and arrangers started to adapt ragtime for small groups and eventually large groups like jazz bands or big bands. And it was a crucial component for the development of the development of jazz in the end of the 19th and early 20th century. The piece we're going to hear now is a ragtime number by James Reese Europe, who was a really fascinating figure. He was one of the most important Black dance band leaders, composers, and arrangers. He was also a very famous member of the military. He ran the Hellfighters marching band, which was very, very famous during World War I and had a big impact not only in the U.S. but abroad, where his band, his Black band, had played syncopated versions of military marches and pop tunes. And so he kind of took the Western classical tradition of the march and performed it with using the syncopated rhythms from the African American community. Again, it's a kind of music that can really only be made in America. Now, this piece is not jazz, there's no improvisation, but it has all the syncopations. And in fact, if you listen carefully, you'll hear that not only does it have all the syncopations, but it has the roots or the bones of a march. In fact, essentially, it is a syncopated march. And so listen to the tuba and to the basses and cellos, etc. As you hear this piece. You'll hear that's the foundation of the march, and on top of it are these syncopated rhythms that are played by the upper instruments, etc. I understand that James Reese Europe had, oh, by the way, I should mention that he, in addition to being well-known in the military, he ran a dance band in New York City, and he wrote this piece for Vernon and Irene Castle, who are a white couple who essentially became the most important tap dancers in American history before these Fred Astaire, etc. Basically, tap dance is a Black dance style that these white dancers helped to popularize among the white communities, and they did that. And James Reese Europe wrote this piece for them. I also discovered he had a Boston connection, that James Reese Europe was murdered in Boston by one member of his band. So I'm hoping that everything goes well. I hope we don't repeat anything today. But you're all my witnesses in case something goes down. All right. Should we tune one more time? Yeah, let's do one. Then we'll go into the rag. that piece was actually arranged and, not arranged, but transcribed and sort of edited by Dr. Schiller, who's a major, very, very important member of the Boston Music Community for many years. The next piece we're going to do is very, very different. There's going to be a bunch of moving around while I talk, so pay no attention to the people behind me. So in the early part of the 20th century, jazz develops and jazz bands start to tour around the United States, and they also start to travel to Europe. And they had a major impact upon European music, the music they brought with them, particularly in places like Paris and Berlin. Black musicians, as well as artists from many different, and intellectuals from the United States, black intellectuals, artists were actually received much more kindly and were accepted much better in Europe than in many places in the United States. And that includes Berlin. Now, when you think of Germany in the 1920s, you may not think of Germany in the 20th century before the first half. You may not think of like openness to people from various different groups. But between World War I and 1933, Germany was a time period in German history called the Weimar Republic. It was when Germany was a democracy for the first time. And it was in Berlin, particularly, African-American artists and intellectuals came and were welcomed, and their music was absorbed by the German musicians. And of course, this all came to a change in 1933 when Hitler took over. But until then, there was this wonderful period of about 15 years where so much intellectual and artistic ferment was happening in Berlin and across Germany. And probably the most important, well, certainly the most important theatrical example of that, or product of that time, as well as musical, is this piece called Three Penny Opera, the text was written by the famous playwright Bertolt Brecht, and the music was by Kurt Weill. And the music, it's essentially, it's a play with some incidental music and some songs, kind of like musical theater. And it was well known because Kurt Weill drew heavily upon jazz in his score. You're going to hear a lot of elements of early jazz in the excerpts from the piece we're going to play now. You're going to hear trumpet and trombone solos, oftentimes using mutes, like you find in jazz bands. You're going to hear the banjo, which is an instrument that we never hear in orchestral music, but was, of course, extremely important in early jazz. It's actually an African instrument. You're also going to hear harmonies that you might remind you of Duke Ellington's, these rich harmonies. And probably the other way that you're going to sort of recognize that this sounds different than orchestra music normally is that there are no strings. This was written for essentially a pit orchestra, but without strings at all. And so it really reflects that sort of sound world, brass and woodwind and percussion heavy of jazz, and early jazz, and these ragtime bands. You might notice, if you're listening carefully, in the second movement of this little suite, or the movements we're going to do, is the original version of the song Mac the Knife, which is a really famous pop song made popular by Bobby Darin in the 50s or 60s. And this is the original version written by Kurt Weill. You're going to hear it playing trombone solo over here. So you may recognize it. If you don't go listen to it, there are lots of great versions of it. So this is three movements from the little three-penny suite by Kurt Weill from Three Penny Opera. jewel of the program, the William Grant Still Afro-Americans. So George Gershwin was one of the best known originally best known as a composer of great Broadway songs and Broadway musicals. But he became equally well known for his classical pieces later in the 1920s. Rhapsody in Blue is a piece you probably heard before. It's used in the old United Airlines commercials. And American in Paris is another one of those, an orchestral tone poem. And like a lot of his orchestral music, it heavily borrows from jazz, from jazz tradition. Syncopations all over the place, solos by trumpets and trombones using mutes, the saxophone, which of course you heard in the chord bio as well as these lush harmonies of Duke Ellington. So it's interesting. This piece, American in Paris, is it's sort of a perfect American piece because it's drawing from elements of the African American tradition as well as the European classical traditions, and they're sort of combined. Now, what's interesting about this piece is that when Gershwin uses these elements of like syncopation, or he refers to elements of African American music, he's not doing so in sort of a way that's meant to evoke America's rural past. He's not choosing these folk songs to sort of gesture toward, the 18th or 19th century. Sort of folk music maybe gave rise to the jazz tradition. For Gershwin and for so many classical composers, including people who only wrote classical music, the syncopations and the sounds of jazz were very modern to their ears. First of all, the syncopations and the ways that jazz musicians played were fully new. So it just this appealed to the modernist interest in all kinds of new kinds of sounds. But also, all these sort of exciting brass and woodwind heavy sounds, the use of percussion, the syncopation, they really call to mind the modern urban landscape of the 20th century. So this is a great example of modernism in the sense that it's using these new kinds of sounds, these new musical structures, not to look backwards to like an old bygone time, a folk past, but instead to capture the spirit of the new age. So in this piece, it's a tone poem that's meant to evoke the modern city of Paris in the 1920s. And you're going to hear, of course, there must have been a lot of jazz happening in Paris, but you're also going to hear, the way he sort of uses the instruments to sort of evoke the clatter of the urban cityscape. In fact, there's a wonderful part near the beginning where he uses dissonances to almost imitate, well, to literally call to mind the sound of horns, like car horns going, you'll hear it when that happens. So you'll definitely recognize this tune. It's got some wonderful melodies. It's really, really fun. It's got solos by trumpet and trombone, and it's really just one of the great examples of American music, orchestral music, that draws from the African American